From New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, this is Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Westin. We start, as every day we start, with the markets. And Scarlett Fu, I'm delighted to say, is joining us today to take us through the markets. So markets, they're down, Scarlett, but not as bad as they were at one point.
Yeah, we certainly opened lower because there's a lot of carryover of weakness from Europe and Asia. There's a concern over a second wave of infections. We've seen cases increase in Florida, Texas, California, as well as Arizona. And of course, a new outbreak in Beijing at a time when data out of that country shows, yes, things are improving, but probably not to the extent that we're going to get a V-shaped recovery that will get to what we saw before the crisis. Now, Gina Martin-Adams of Bloomberg Intelligence says we've entered this new equity market regime where any index move higher now gets rockier, so more volatility. Future bursts of strength are dependent on economic and earnings green shoots, and leadership is shifting defensively. And you see that right here with the NASDAQ 100 doing better than the Dow Industrials. Big tech is once again seen as a haven and growth play because they continue to see demand for their products and services and have the balance sheet to ride out this disruption. Of course, havens are in favor. You can see the 10-year yield move south again to 68 basis points, and the dollar edges higher for a fourth day in 5. As you mentioned, David, indexes are steadily coming off their lows. There's still a lot of trading day to go, but buy the dip that has worked so well in the rally since March 23rd seems to be a little bit in effect here.
Another narrative we've been seeing actually is sort of a divergence between Main Street and Wall Street going on. How important is potentially more fiscal stimulus from Congress? When are we going to see something that might help Main Street along?
Well, that's going to be critical this week, especially with Jay Powell speaking to Congress, starting with the Senate tomorrow and, of course, to the House Financial Services Committee on Wednesday. That's going to be a big issue, especially since you see data like Empire Manufacturing today come in better than expected. We also get retail sales as well as industrial production on Tuesday. Housing starts on Wednesday, and housing has been doing very well in this economy as certainly mortgage rates have come down, and a lot of people are looking to reconfigure where they're living to adjust for the changes that we've seen in the economy overall. By and large, data has been surprising to the upside. So if you look at an economic surprise index, it's been going up, up, and up. The trick there, though, or the tricky thing there, though, is that it's not going to last. It's a self-correcting mechanism because as data gets better, because the economy reopens, economists start to move up their estimates. They get more optimistic. And as they continue to move up their estimates, at some point, the data is going to start disappointing, and you'll get a self-correcting mechanism in place there. And we'll start to see that rollover in economic surprises. And maybe that'll be reflected in equity markets. David?
Terrific. It's really great to have you with us, Scarlett. Thank you so much for that report on the markets. Part of what happened today was we got some China numbers out, and they indicated that maybe China's on the way to recovery, but they also indicated how long that's going to take and how difficult it may be. Anna Ashton now joins us from the U.S.-China Business Council, where she is Senior Director for Global Affairs. So, Anna, welcome back. Great to have you here. What did you read out of those numbers? I mean, we were up, actually, in industrial production, but not as much as expected. We were down in retail sales more than we thought.
Right. I mean, I think, it is true that China's not likely to stage some earth-shattering recovery this year. The numbers are bearing that out. But at the same time, Chinese factories are up and running. There's been a year-on-year increase in value-added industrial production. And while the retail and investment numbers are lower than they were this time last year, we are seeing that Chinese consumers are beginning to spend more money than they were earlier in the year. And the reality is that China is the only major world economy that the World Bank says is likely to post positive growth in 2020. So, it's going to be an important engine of global GDP growth just by virtue of that fact.
Yes, we are also getting reports now of new cases popping up, particularly in Beijing, and a lot of concern over in Beijing. What effect might that have on the Chinese consumer?
I guess it remains to be seen exactly how Beijing ultimately weathers a second wave, just as it remains to be seen how we will weather a second wave, which it seems like is increasingly inevitable. But, they have to date shown a strong ability to lock things down as swiftly as possible and as efficiently as possible, and then open up faster than we have been able to. So I would expect that maybe it will decrease the prospects of positive growth, but it will probably not change the fact that China is set to come out of this better than most countries.
Anna, give us a sense of the members for your organization, U.S.-China Business Council, and their appetite for continuing to do business at the same big rate that they had been in China. Are they starting to lose some of that appetite given, number one, the trade disputes, but now the pandemic?
It's a little bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, no, because there are a significant portion of our members are in China for the China market. You know, their operations are there in order to serve the Chinese market, and the Chinese market is enormous. It's only getting bigger. They need to be in China and serving that market successfully in order to be globally competitive. So those companies, I don't think have lost any appetite for the China market. They're just weathering a bad quarter or two as the COVID-19 outbreak and its effects on the economy there play out. Certainly, the politics in the U.S.-China relationship have been a huge strain on our companies for the last few years, basically since the beginning of the Trump administration. In our annual member surveys, members have listed the political relationship, the bilateral relationship, as the number one concern they have when it comes to their business interests in China, and that's extremely unusual. Before the Trump administration, that was never even in the top 10. That remains a very significant concern for members, and not just because of the administration, but also because Congress, on both sides of the aisle, has been rolling out bill after bill after bill that is focused on China in relatively punitive ways, or sometimes very punitive ways, that are likely to really negatively impact the business relationship. So there is some concern about what the long-term prospects for this bilateral business relationship are.
And even as President Trump says some fairly confrontational things about China, he still says he has hopes for that phase one. Remember that back before the pandemic, that phase one deal with China. Do your members share that hope, or have they given up on that?
Our members absolutely share that hope. From their perspective, this is an incredibly important deal. No, it didn't deliver everything that U.S. companies hoped it would deliver, but it certainly brought the U.S. and China back to a bit more normalized negotiation, and it did make some important progress on a variety of fronts, not just the purchase agreements, but also various ag regulations, as well as IP and tech transfer, and financial services. So our members really want to it's very important to them that the deal successfully be implemented. We also have heard from USTR, as well as from other parts of the U.S. government and the Chinese government, that there is no phase two negotiation, which will get to the meatier issues the business is concerned about, until there is a successful implementation of phase one. So monitoring phase one implementation, making sure that the government continues to pay attention to the phase one deal is very, very important to our members. And so far, we've heard from both governments that things are coming along well. Granted, the purchase agreements, the reporting is mixed on that. There's some concern that China is not going to be able to meet its commitments this year. But, the reality is that China has been stepping up its purchases in the agricultural space all year long, and has bought far more than it bought by this time last year, and it's not even seasonally the right time for them to be buying these things. So it's clear that China is trying.
Yep. Right. Anna, thank you so much for joining us. Anna Ashton of the U.S.-China Business Council. Coming up here, we're going to talk with the head of one of the largest and most prestigious hospitals in the country, Dr. Steve Corwin of York-Presbyterian, for a report on the coronavirus. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. It's time now for First Word News. And for that, we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. The Food and Drug Administration is no longer approving the use of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine to treat COVID-19. The FDA has revoked emergency use authorization for the drugs, saying they are unlikely to work against the virus and could have dangerous side effects. President Trump has touted the two anti-malaria drugs as a treatment for the virus and said he had been taking the medication as a precaution. A number of states saw their coronavirus case numbers climb over the weekend. Texas and Florida reported record numbers of new infections. The surge in those states and others, including Arizona and North Carolina, has led to concern among public health officials that reopening the economy has come at the cost of spreading the virus. The United States has more than 2 million confirmed infections and more than 115,000 deaths. That's according to data compiled by Johns Hopkins University. Several big rulings from the Supreme Court today. Justices ruled that workers cannot be fired simply because they are gay or transgender. By a vote of 6-3, the court said federal law protects gay workers from job discrimination. Meanwhile, justices dealt a major blow to the gun rights movement. They turned away 10 appeals that sought to broaden constitutional firearms protections. The head of the United Nations Atomic Watchdog Agency is once again demanding that Iran provide inspectors access to sites where there is suspected nuclear activity. Iran says the International Atomic Energy Agency has no legal basis to inspect the 3 sites in question, since all activities there are thought to have been from the early 2000s. That's before Iran signed that landmark 2015 nuclear deal with world powers. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much to Mark Crumpton. Well, the rate of increase of coronavirus in New York is the lowest it's been in months. And we're going to go now to somebody who's been fighting on the front lines to ensure that result. He's Dr. Steve Corwin. He is the president and CEO of the New York-Presbyterian Hospital System. So, Dr. Corwin, thank you so very much for being with us. As I say, you really are proverbially on the front lines. Give us how it looks from where you are, where you're fighting the battle. How does it look in New York right now?
Oh, much better, David. No question about the fact that at our peak, we were at about 2,700 cases throughout my hospital system. That represented about 80% of our capacity. We're down to less than 350 cases now in our institutions, and much less in terms of ICU care. So we clearly have been on the downward trend, and thankfully that's continued and taken up some of the pressure, or taken off some of the pressure on our system.
So the next stage has to be, how worried are we about an uptick? We're seeing it in some of the states, not big numbers, but the rate is disturbing. We also now see it in Beijing as well. How concerned are you that here in New York we could have an uptick?
Well, I'm concerned across the country that we're going to have an uptick. You're now seeing some hotspots potentially in Houston, Phoenix, parts of Florida. You can't let this get out of control, because then contact tracing goes out the window. And that's when you really put pressure on the hospital system as a whole. I'm concerned about people becoming weary about social distancing. Even with the opening up, one can still maintain social distancing. I think people are weary of that, and therefore we need to be wary of an uptick in infections and follow that closely. In the other areas of the country, you need to follow not just the increase in infections, because if you test more, you're going to find more people have it, but what's the hospitalization rate? And that's where I get concerned in speaking to colleagues in Houston and Phoenix, David.
And so are we better prepared for an uptick at this point from things we've learned about the virus and how to treat it? And for that matter, on some of the equipment issues like ventilators and personal protective equipment, are we better prepared for an uptick when it comes?
No question about it. We're better prepared. We could deal with the second wave more effectively, both from the standpoint of state and city government, as well as how hospitals need to prepare for it. We know how to surge. We've changed the way that we look at how much protective equipment we need, how many ventilators we need, how much ICU capacity we need. So I think we're better prepared for it, but let's just remember, we still are only talking about supportive therapy. We don't have an effective therapy. We don't have an effective vaccine. And so keeping the transmission rate less than 1 is how you don't overwhelm the economy or the hospital system.
And as a practical matter, what is the likelihood of an effective treatment or a vaccine? There's a lot of talk about it even by the end of the year. It's impossible to know for sure, but what do you think about the prospects?
You know, we should all be rooting for it. There's no question about it. I think it's more likely that we will start to see effective combination therapies before the end of the year than we will see an effective vaccine. But we hope for both. if passed as prelude, the earliest development of a vaccine took about 4 years, and that's the mumps vaccine. So I would be dubious to think that we could get mass inoculations in 20 or 21. I think the first set will be people on the front lines volunteering for vaccination. Then you have to determine whether it's efficacious over a period of time and whether it causes side effects. There are some vaccines that can actually worsen the disease. So we still have a long road to go. But in terms of the amount of effort put into it, let's root for our biotech and big pharma firms to come up with something, because this is a very, very serious disease and with a high mortality associated with it if you need to be hospitalized. No question about that.
Dr. Corwin, when we talk about the tools we have to use, we've talked before there was a pandemic, about the role of technology. What role is telemedicine playing, and it can play a larger role going forward as we have problems?
Well, we've crossed the Rubicon on telemedicine. Before the pandemic, about 3% of our visits were telemedicine visits. Post-pandemic, we're at about 40 to 45% of our office visits are telemedicine visits. During the pandemic, it was almost universal that the only way we would see patients was with telemedicine. So I think that's here to stay. As technology improves, as remote patient monitoring improves, we'll be able to do more with telemedicine. It will become part of the way that physicians and nurse practitioners and others see patients. And I think we can do a better job with that. So this is just an acceleration of the trend. And I think there's no turning back on that at this point. So telemedicine is here to stay, no question about
it. And finally, Dr. Corwin, I have to ask about your colleagues. I mean, they've been through really a war with all the consequences of that. How are they doing? What are you trying to do for people who have been exhausted, have seen things that no one should have to see?
Well, we put a lot of mental health and well-being supports in place. A lot of anonymous consultative services from our psychiatrists are in place. But the first thing for healthcare workers is to not think that you can just tough it out, because that's the way that we train people. You can get through this. You can tough it out. This has been horrific. I worry very much about people having to go through a second wave of this. So we're offering all sorts of emotional support services for all of our workers, really. We had a tragic suicide of a leader of one of our emergency departments who went home to Charlottesville on leave to try to recover from an episode of depression. So this can affect people acutely. And more importantly, people have to recognize it can affect people after the fact, once the pandemic has passed. So we're very concerned right now about the emotional health and well-being of all of our employees. And I would urge us to keep in mind that as we go through this pandemic with frontline healthcare workers. They really have put their lives on the line.
Yeah, and we owe all of you. I think everybody in the New York area really realizes how much we owe you. Thank you so much, Stephen. That's Dr. Stephen Corwin. He is the president and CEO of New York-Presbyterian Hospital System. Coming up here, there's more in the saga of Carlos Ghosn as an exclusive Bloomberg report uncovers some more evidence about what may have led to it. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, from the very beginning, Carlos Ghosn has insisted that the reason he got arrested over in Tokyo is because people didn't want him moving Renault and Nissan closer together. And now there's some new evidence to suggest he may be right about that. We welcome now Brian Bremner. He is our executive editor for Global Business with Bloomberg, and he has the story. Brian, explain to us what we uncovered at Bloomberg and revealed that sort of would tend to confirm Carlos Ghosn's side of this story.
Well, as you know, this has been kind of a multi-act drama really since late last year when Carlos Ghosn kind of fled Japan ahead of a trial, went to Lebanon, and he made the case when he could talk publicly and freely that he was set up by a group of executives in Nissan who objected to his plans to intensify an existing alliance between Nissan and Renault. And as you may recall, there were some financial charges leveled by Tokyo prosecutors that he was facing. He always said that wasn't the issue. The real issue here was that there was this plot against me by a group of very powerful players inside Nissan. So what we've found is some evidence to suggest that there's something to Ghosn's claim. And the reason we say that is we've had access to emails, to other documents, to strategic memos, and we also were able to substantiate that with other people who were players and had kind of direct knowledge of the events that have transpired. And what they show collectively is that roughly 9 months before Ghosn was ever arrested, on that fateful day back in November of 2018, there was a running conversation about this guy had to go, that his efforts to intensify the merger were terrible for Nissan, and that by removing Ghosn, there was an opportunity to to redo the alliance on terms much more favorable to Nissan.
Yeah, Brian, at the same time, I suppose it's possible that both sides are right. That is to say that, yeah, there was sort of a plot to get rid of Carlos Ghosn, but at the same time, Carlos Ghosn may have done something wrong at the same time. The one doesn't necessarily exclude the other.
That's right. And this, just to be clear, this story does not litigate the financial indictments against Mr. Ghosn. The only way that we're going to get a final say on that would be in a trial setting in Tokyo, which is now highly unlikely because Mr. Ghosn left, and Lebanon and Japan don't have any kind of extradition treaty. So those issues are still out there. But I think what's new is that Nissan always insisted this was always about these alleged financial improprieties and nothing else. And they said that consistently for roughly a year. They told their shareholders that. They told the public that. And it doesn't look like that was the whole story. And at the same time, Nissan's stock is about 50% lower than it was when Ghosn's arrested. And one could argue that Renault's efforts to kind of create a bigger merger with Fiat never were able to go to fruition.
It's quite a story, as you say. Thank you so much to Brian Bremner, our colleague in London. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. It's time now for First Word News, and we turn to Mark Crumpton.
David, the Food and Drug Administration is no longer approving the use of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine to treat COVID-19. The FDA has revoked emergency use authorization for the drugs, saying they are unlikely to work against the virus and could have dangerous side effects. President Trump had touted the two anti-malaria drugs as a treatment for the virus and said he had been taking them as a precaution. A Moscow court found former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan guilty of spying and sentenced him to 16 years in prison. That's according to his family. Whelan says he's innocent and was set up by a Russian security officer who owed him money. Moscow says he was caught with computer flash drives containing classified information. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has stepped back into the Brexit fray. He began talks today with the European Union's top officials, with both sides looking to reset negotiations that have drifted into stalemate. It's the Prime Minister's first direct intervention in the discussions since the UK left the bloc at the end of January. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Well, when Congress stepped in to try to help small businesses across the country, it discovered that one of the obstacles is a lot of the smallest businesses really don't have access to a bank the way larger corporations do. Well, the so-called Community Development Financial Institutions, or CDFIs, help try to bridge that gap We welcome now the president of one of those. He is the CEO of Southern Bancorp. He is Darrin Williams. Thank you very much for being with us, Mr. Williams. So you do this down in Arkansas and Mississippi, as I understand it. First of all, just explain what your institution does. What's the nature of your clients? What's the size of the typical loans you make?
So sure, first of all, David, thank you for having us. So we are a CDFI, as you explained, and as such, 60% of our activity must take place in what we call low and moderate income census tracts. So we serve the rural Arkansas, Mississippi Delta, one of the most persistently poor communities of all the United States. And so, our loans range in size. In our PPP loans that we're talking about now, the smallest we did was $200. The largest was almost $5 million. We did about 1,279 PPP loans over the course of these loans have been going on, for about $111 million that go back into communities to help support the jobs of the businesses in the markets we serve, and which is very needed. And many of the businesses we talked to said those loans were the lifeline of their business. Several would have had to shut down, but for access to the PPP dollars. In fact, I can remember a healthy clinic in Clarksdale, Mississippi. This is a minority-owned health clinic that provides comprehensive health care services to all of that community. 4 full-time employees, 2 part-time employees, and they would close their doors but for those PPP loans. So those are the folks that we provide access to capital and credit, and in this case, COVID relief through the PPP program.
So Darrin, you're known for the fact that you're really hands-on. I mean, you deal directly with these customers. You approve loans specifically, personally. Give us a sense, what happens when the PPP money runs out? I mean, can these people hold on? Is this going to tide them over to get them to the other side, so to speak?
Yeah, David, that's what we're real concerned about. So the PPP loan dollars had some restrictions on how those proceeds could be used. At least 60% had to be used for employees, or putting people on the payroll. And that was the crux of that program, to keep people employed, to keep them working. We know because of COVID-19, because of the coronavirus, the economy is not fully recovered. People don't have the confidence to go back in the marketplace or to really enter the marketplace. And so many businesses still are seeing a significant decrease in their revenues. People have not come back. For example, our hospitality industry, restaurants, hotels, hotels operating at 30-40% capacity, or sometimes even less. Restaurants, because of the rules around social distancing, have to operate at less than capacity. So their revenues are shut down, and there's so many other things that folks need resources for, more than just paying employees. So if we don't regain consumer confidence, the economy doesn't open back soon, I'm afraid that we will see many of these businesses continue to suffer and may have to even lay off employees, and some, unfortunately, may not make it through. But I'm hopeful that as Congress thinks about and debates additional forms of relief, working with the administration, that we can find ways to support America's small business, particularly those that are in underserved markets, because those jobs are the backbone of those communities.
So give us a sense of unemployment down there in Arkansas and in the Mississippi Delta, as you referred to it. We heard from the president, the president of the Fed, Mr. Kaplan, who said really he's concerned about unemployment and the fact that it may keep going, it may be very high by the end of the year. This is part of what he had to say. This is Mr. Kaplan.
Depending on how fast the service sector comes back and people re-engage, we're still going to have an elevated level of unemployment, maybe as high, based on my forecast, of 8% or more. And it means that some people won't be able to go back to their old jobs and will have to find new jobs.
So apply that down to your area, if you would, Mr. Williams. Are you seeing situations where you think the jobs just aren't going to come back? What kind of level of unemployment are you experiencing?
Well, unfortunately, I couldn't agree with him more. And remember, the Arkansas Mississippi Delta is one of the most persistently poor communities of all the United States. So the unemployment numbers in our communities were already elevated. Even when the economy was flourishing, we were struggling, and we continue to struggle. That's the nature of the markets that we serve. And so I am concerned that if consumer confidence doesn't come back, if people don't re-enter the marketplace, that many people will find themselves without jobs. And it wouldn't be surprising if we saw double-digit unemployment in the markets we serve. That's why we think it's so important that we provide as much relief as we can to our borrowers, and that we hope that Congress and the administration will continue to find solutions that reach the smallest of small businesses in the markets that we serve and others like ours throughout the United States.
So you mentioned particularly the plight of things like restaurateurs, people who have small restaurants down there. Give us a sense of the economy. Are people starting to come back and going to restaurants and things? How much of it is locked down still? How eager are people to get out?
Well, I can say consumer confidence is not completely back. There's kind of a mixed bag in different markets that we serve. We have 48 locations throughout Arkansas and Mississippi, and all the markets are a little different. Some of the markets in the Mississippi Delta, for example, they rely heavily on tourism, blues festivals and other events throughout the summer that really help those economies thrive and actually make it. That's where many of the governments make their tax dollars to support the government infrastructure throughout the year. And those festivals, those programs have been canceled. And so it's going to be tough for many of these communities to make it, and many of the people that work in those communities who may find themselves unemployed. It's going to be a tough time, but we're going to do all we can. You know, rural America is resilient. The Delta is resilient. We're going to do all we can to ensure that we can bounce back and recover, and really not recover, but hopefully do better than we were doing before.
Are you counting on more help from Congress? That is to say, the so-called fourth tranche of fiscal stimulus?
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about that, right? So we're fortunate to be in a position where we have real access to our legislative leaders and even to the administration. So I think you had Congressman French Hill on your show recently, and he's a true advocate for us. He's a former community banker, former member of the CDFI Fund Advisory Board, so he understands the importance of CDFIs to the communities that we serve. And so we're hopeful that folks like Congressman Hill and others who understand the plight of small town America, they will provide support and assistance that's really targeted toward not just big business, but targeted toward small businesses that really are the backbone that make these economies in small town America, make them thrive.
Well, on that very subject, apart from Congress, the Fed also has been trying to help. Today, they opened up their so-called Main Street lending facility. Is that something that could help people down in your neck of the woods?
Yeah, so we're looking at that very closely. We've been talking to the Feds, and fortunately, I was able to participate in a recent Fed Listens session. And the Fed's done a lot of things to try to, I guess, improve that program when it was first announced. The initial lending threshold was about $1 million. They've reduced that down to about $500,000. And so, again, the loans that we do are really small loans. And these small business loans really are the backbone of those small businesses thriving. And so we don't have a lot of businesses that can access a $500,000 loan. But we're looking at those that might be able to access that type of program, and we're going to make it available, not just the Main Street Lending Program, but any program that the administration and Congress provides that will help our small businesses, help our communities. We're going to do all we can to support them.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so very much. That's really a thorough report on what's going on down in Arkansas and the Mississippi Delta. That's from Darrin Williams. He is Southern Bancorp CEO. There's a lot of concern, part of the concern on consumers' part, about a possible second wave. And earlier today, Joshua Sharfstein, he is Vice Dean of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, talked to Bloomberg Surveillance. I should mention that that School of Public Health is supported by Michael R. Bloomberg, who is the founder of Bloomberg LP and also Bloomberg Philanthropies. This is what Dr. Sharfstein had to say.
Well, first they say that the virus is very persistent and, it's not that easy to get rid of. And that if you let your guard down, it will come back. And in the United States, there's no question that there are parts of the country that have let their guard down somewhat. That not just that they've opened, but that people have sort of mentally moved past, I think, the rigor that they need to follow in order to prevent infection. And the delay to see a rise is probably more like 6 weeks than 2 weeks. And so 6 weeks after the opening, we're starting to see surges in a number of states.
Joshua, when you look at the difference between Beijing and the U.S., what's happening in Beijing? We understand there that actually social distancing is very much respected, that everyone wears a mask. So how do you deal with that? Is it a mutating virus, or is it just unlucky?
I don't think the virus is mutating so quickly that it's the main cause of what's going on. I think the virus is, persistent, and people travel, and then it can, like in this market in Beijing, it can start to spread again. China has, not hesitated to use some pretty aggressive powers to shut down the virus when it starts to move, things that we really wouldn't do in the United States. But even short of that in the United States, I think people have sort of psychologically moved on maybe in some areas, and that creates an even more fertile ground for spread. You really can't compare what's going on in the United States to Beijing. They have a few cases and they're jumping on them in Beijing. In the United States, we have thousands of cases and a lot of community transmission. And, we still haven't in many areas built the kind of public health response that's necessary to control it.
In the U.S., do you think there'll be a second lockdown, or at least taking more time in reopening certain states because of the number of infections?
Well, we're already seeing that. Utah, Oregon, and now Texas and New York are talking about that. I think it's, certain that as cases go up, people are going to have to do something about it. Now, whether they have to lock everything down again is going to depend a lot on whether or not we have a robust response capability, that will allow us to stay put for a little bit while the cases go down. And that requires contact tracing, isolation, quarantine, real work in public health. And, I think everyone who doesn't want to shut down should be asking, well, where's the public health response that we can count on?
Josh, talk to me a little bit about some of the evidence that we have on antibody treatment.
So the evidence is starting to accumulate that there may well be a real benefit from antibody treatment or convalescent serum, as it's known. There are studies, I believe, from the UK, from China, from the Middle East that are all suggesting a pretty significant benefit, including potentially mortality when it's used before people are very, very, very sick. So when people are sick but not critically ill and on a ventilator, that appears to be when there's a benefit. And that suggests there may be a benefit even earlier, perhaps, at the beginning of illness or even as a preventive treatment, which, of course, is how antibodies were used in the past. So there's still some major, very well-designed studies that are out there. But right now, it's, I think, considered quite promising.
There's a story on the Bloomberg terminal saying that actually the first COVID vaccines may not prevent you from getting the sickness, but it would prevent you from getting it very badly. Does that go to what we're seeing with antibody treatments?
It's possible. I mean, I saw some speculation. One reason we have so many cases still, but fewer deaths, may be that antibody treatment has been used a lot more in the United States than it was a couple months ago. Now, that's speculation, but it sort of speaks to the idea that, one outcome here is we could have some treatments like remdesivir, antibody treatment, and others that really do help prevent death.
That was Vice Dean Joshua Sharfstein of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Coming up here, stock of the hour, the Supreme Court is actually moving markets today involving natural gas. We'll talk about that next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, the shale industry got some good news today from the Supreme Court of the United States when in a 7-2 decision, it said it can go ahead and build a pipeline under the Appalachian Trail. Here to bring us up to date is Abigail Doolittle. So Abigail, moves some markets actually like EQM and things, right?
It's pretty amazing. I love what you're saying there, that the Supreme Court is moving markets in a big way because the shares of EQM Midstream Partners soaring up about 20%, as you were just mentioning. They're a mid-cap company. They have midstream assets in the Appalachian Valley for natural gas assets, and they do have a pipeline involved. But first, let's back up, because the pipeline in question with the Supreme Court is one being developed, hopefully, between Dominion and Duke. It's an $8 billion pipeline, 600 miles between West Virginia, the Marcellus Shale Basin, and customers in North Carolina and Virginia. So the Supreme Court upheld a key permit saying that the Forest Service acted lawfully by clearing a natural gas line to cross underneath the Appalachian Trail. Previously, a federal court had said that they did that not lawfully, so everything had been held up for a while. Reconnecting this back to EQM, they have a Mountain Valley pipeline in West Virginia. It costs more than $4.3 billion. It's 90% complete, but back in December, David, it was halted. So really hurting this stock, which is down quite a bit overall this year and over many time periods, but particularly this year because of that halt. And also, of course, what's happening with oil.
And it's not lost on anyone. This is natural gas, which is terribly important for our energy sector right now.
It is terribly important, and they are a natural gas, again, midstream company. So natural gas in the United States, about 39% of the energy. Relative to this pipeline being developed by Dominion and Duke, it's expected to be able to transport 1.5 billion cubic feet. So EQM shareholders are going to really welcome this. Look at EQM, or in that those shares are down sharply over the last year by about 48%. So again, they will welcome any good news. That pipeline that they have developed separately can perhaps get back underway. And again, maybe that will help EQM midstream partners stop underperforming the broader indexes, David.
Thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on EQM. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, the nation is facing a pandemic, an economic downturn, and real race relations issues all at the same time as it heads into an election come this fall. We welcome now the National Press Secretary for Vice President Joe Biden's campaign for presidency. He is TJ Ducklow, also known as, I believe it is called Tyler Joseph, but I think he goes by TJ. Welcome, Mr. Ducklow. It's great to have you with us. Give us a sense, with like 4.5 months left to go, what's the strategy?
Hey, David. It is great to be with you. Well, look, I think it is clear since the beginning of this coronavirus crisis that Donald Trump has not been up to the job of leading this country. And, you know, it was his inaction and it was his failure to listen to warnings from his own advisors that has led to over 20 million Americans being out of work. You know, and that failure continues because now what you're seeing this week and throughout the country is Donald Trump wants to slap like an open for business sign on the country and hope for the best without doing any of the necessary work to give consumers and workers and small businesses and communities the tools they need to reopen safely and effectively. And that's all the while that, you know, there are 20 plus states who are seeing surges in their number of cases. And so, you know, we have never really had a coherent national public health response that has mobilized the sources we need. And Joe Biden is proposing just that. He is proposing an 8-part plan to make sure that we can safely and strongly reopen. And I can run through that now with you. But the bottom line is, the bottom line is that you know, what we need is a competent federal government and a competent president to be leading the way, and that's just not what we're seeing.
Well, I mean, 8 points maybe a little more much for television, as you know television so well. But give us in a nutshell, on the subject of the economy, what would Joe Biden do that Donald Trump's not doing?
I think one of the biggest things we have seen on the economy, David, is that, you know, Trump has overseen this sort of corrupt recovery, which is no surprise given the way that he has run his administration the last 4 years. You know, we know that this virus is impacting communities of color in a way that is hitting them harder, and that they are dying at higher rates. And this crisis is shining a light and exacerbating a lot of the systemic issues and inequalities in our society that the VP has been talking about for a long time. Things like paid sick leave, things like $15 minimum wage, things like workplace protections. And so we have to start addressing these issues head on. We have to root them out. And, you know, these are things that Joe Biden has been fighting for his entire career. And that's the kind of thing you will see from him as president.
Well, one of the things we heard just recently from the president with a tweet was he's done more for African Americans in this country in 3.5 years than Joe Biden did in 43 years, is what he said. Mainly because, as you know, the income for African Americans before this recession was going up. Does the president have something of a point there?
No, you know, David, we're also seeing historic unemployment rates for the African American community, hitting those communities harder than it is other folks. I think last month you saw Black youth unemployment spike 7 points to 35%, and you're also seeing Hispanic unemployment 4 times higher than it was before Trump botched his response to this pandemic. You know, I think the bottom line on that is that, you know, there are over 10 million Americans who had jobs on the day that Barack Obama and Joe Biden left office who are unemployed today, and Donald Trump doesn't have a plan to fix that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Are we going to see more of Vice President Biden than we have in recent past? I mean, you have a challenge because the President of the United States always has a bully pulpit, but boy, this one sure has a bully pulpit, and he uses it regularly.
Well, look, I think we are starting to get out more. You saw it last week, Vice President Biden meeting with folks in downtown Delaware, meeting with mayors, having conversations with faith leaders. I mean, he is doing the things that you would really want to see from a president right now, leading this really incredibly important national conversation, and he's proposing real reforms. He is out talking about banning chokeholds. He's talking about creating a national use of force standard. Talking about directing more money to community policing, this is a conversation around systemic racism and around inequality and injustice that is long overdue. It is a conversation that we need to have, and we need to have real reform, and that is what we are out talking about every day with the American people, and that is what Donald Trump continues to fail to lead on.
Yeah, we're going to have a wild 4.5 months here, I think it's fair to say. I really appreciate you being here. That's TJ Duplo. He is National Press Secretary for the Vice President for President campaign. And that does it for the first hour of Balance of Power for today. We will continue on radio for our second hour. We'll be joined, among others, by Maddie Duppler of the National Taxpayers Union, because there's a lot going on with state taxes. This is Bloomberg.